Welcome to the NASIG 2020 session, Getting on the Same Page, Aligning ERM and LibGuides Content, presented by Todd Enoch. From the University of North Texas. Please refer to SCED for a complete biography of the speaker. Please also participate in our online forum, which can be located at the NASIG website with questions or comments about this session. These links are provided below this video. NASIG's Code of Conduct applies to all discussions on the forum. Please tweet about the session using the hashtag NASIG 2020. You can advance the slide. We would like to thank the NASIG sponsors for helping us make our online conference freely available.
All right, thank you. My name is Todd Enoch, and I am the head of subscription and resource management at the University of North Texas Libraries. I'd like to thank you for coming to my presentation, Getting on the Same Page, Aligning ERM and LibGuides Content. In the presentation today, I'll be talking about a little bit of the history of electronic resource management systems and subject and course guides at UNT, primarily from the point of view of how they interact with electronic resources. And to start off with, I'll talk a little bit about the University of North Texas, a little background. UNT is located in Denton, Texas. If you're not familiar with Denton, we're located about equidistant from Dallas and Fort Worth, where Interstate 35 turns into I-35 East and I-35 West. That's Denton, in fact, right outside my apartment. We're a research institution with an FTE of a little over 31,000. The UNT libraries have 6 physical locations, 4 of which are open to the public. Normally, we have a few less open to the public right now. We also have 2 remote storage facilities, one of which, the library annex, is where my department is located and where I've been working since December of 2001. I started at UNT in the cataloging unit as a staff member, then I moved over to serials unit as a staff member, and after getting my MLS, I became a librarian in 2005 and have been working with serials and electronic resources in one way or another since then. In terms of our technology base at the libraries, for our knowledge base, we use Serial Solutions 360 KB. For our ILS, we use III Sierra. And for subject and course guides, we host those on SpringShare's LibGuides platform. So I'm going to start off talking a bit about electronic resource management systems at UNT. And when I first started, we had a homegrown ERMS named Electronic Resource Database, or ERDB. And it was created by a programmer who worked at the libraries at the time. And as a homegrown ERMS, it had some pros and some cons. The thing that was nicest about it that's kind of relevant to what I'm going to be talking about today was the fact that it could generate friendly URLs. So whenever a database underwent the inevitable change of its base URL, we didn't have to go out and change the URL everywhere on the website and in the catalog or in emails or bookmarks. As long as people use the friendly URL, we could just update the base URL in the ERDB, and then the friendly URL would now direct to that new thing. Unfortunately, in early 2012, the ERDB underwent a catastrophic server failure. Our technology group tried their best to fix it, but eventually discovered it was going to be unsalvageable and recommended that we find another way to handle our ERMS needs. So in mid-2012, we migrated to III's ERM module. We've been a III subscriber since before I started in 2001. At that point in time, we were on Millennium, not Sierra. But we moved over to there in mid-2012. One of the biggest pros for making this move was that it integrated our ER workflow into our ILS workflows. So now our order records, which are already in the ILS, were more closely linked to our license records and our resource records and our e-journal records. So that was really nice in terms of just being able to see all of our information in one place. The biggest con was we lost the friendly URLs and had to find other ways to make sure that it was easy for people to keep the URLs updated. And thankfully, there was a way. I'll get to that in a little bit. Now, my very first presentation ever at NASIG several years ago was about our ERM migration and the lessons we learned because it was such a rush job getting the migration done. We didn't take full advantage of all the functionality of the ERM module. But one thing we did take advantage of was the ability to create an authorized list of subject headings in the ERM. So with the ERM module, you can create a list of subject headings that are authorized to use in your subject field. And then when you go into update your resource records, you just double click in the subject field and it brings up a browsable list of all of the acceptable subject headings. If you start typing in the field, it will also start to autocomplete. So if you only have one subject that starts with the letter Z, you can just type Z and see zoology pop up. You just have to be careful that if you're starting to type in English, you don't hit enter too soon or it might accidentally auto-populate with engineering. The subject list that we created was pretty broad and not LC. There were no subdivisions of headings. It was largely based on departments and degree programs. So we just kind of had a really broad array of subjects. They were initially discoverable primarily through a database subject search in the OPAC, but most people didn't navigate to that search option. So what people really saw was through the browsable subject list on our library website's database tab. So our user interfaces group that controlled the library website created a browsable list where someone could just click on art and it would take them to that database subject search in the OPAC for art. Over time, we started to add new subjects as liaisons requested them. And this led to a wide degree of subject specificity depending on the different departments' needs. So the mathematics department was pretty much happy just to have math as the subject, and they didn't need anything else. But for the art department, they wanted to have subjects for art and artists, art iconography, art history, design, and so on and so forth. And for the most part, whenever liaisons requested new subjects, we didn't really push back at all. We figured if they felt strong enough to reach out to us, there was probably a good need for it. But we did reserve the right to be able to say, that doesn't really fit our scheme of what a subject is in the ERM. Not that we were super precious about that, because we wound up using the subject field for a couple of workarounds for some other things. First of all, we had lots of people who wanted to be able to browse lists of just databases in specific formats or specific types. So for example, people really wanted to be able to see a list of all of our newspaper databases or all of our streaming video databases. And it was really hard to pull that information out of the resource type field that we had in the ERM. It was available to be viewable and searchable through keywords, but not really searchable with just that information. So we wound up creating subject headings for highly requested formats, newspapers, videos, data sets, etc. And then had user interfaces add those subjects to the subject browse list. And that's a important thing to mention, is that subject browse list on the website was not automatically populated when we added or removed or updated subject headings. We had to contact user interfaces and ask them to do that manually. Another thing that we did, since the ERDB was our visible A to Z list and the ERM was not really set up nicely to do an ERM A to Z list, we cobbled one together with user interfaces help by creating a database letter headings to generate the public-facing A to Z list. So every database whose title started with A had a subject of database A. And then in the A to Z list, if you clicked on the link for the A, it would do the database subject search for database A subjects and then bring up a list of everything that started with an A. Not the most elegant solution, and it had some clunkiness, but it worked for us at that point in time. Now I'm going to do a little detour to talk a little bit about the history of subject and course guides at UNT. Something that I have much less interaction with as the ER librarian, but I do have a little bit of experience with certain aspects of it. Initially, subject and course guides were just hosted on the main library website, and the people who were responsible for maintaining those had to use whatever the HTML editor was for the website at the time to go in and add information for anything they needed. So they had to add all the information for electronic resources manually. Now with the friendly URLs, that made maintaining the URLs not that big of a problem, but if there were any other changes to ER information, such as changes in the number of consecutive users, changes in titles, or cancellations that need to be removed, we had to send out a notice to all the liaisons about these changes and count on them to remember which ones they did and didn't have on various guides, and then remember to go in and manually update them. So we didn't have a lot of control over how the ER information was being displayed to the public. In 2012, we migrated to SpringShare's LibGuides platform for all of our subject and course guides. And if you're not familiar with LibGuides, it's a platform that allows a lot more flexibility and functionality than you can get with just a basic HTML editor, unless all your staff is really well-versed in coding and more advanced HTML. Now, the initial admin for LibGuides did create some best practices and guidelines for users, but over time, there was very little oversight to make sure that people were following these best practices and guidelines. And this also led to a proliferation of subject headings, because much like with the ERM subject headings, you'd have people who said, hey, I think that we need subjects for art iconography or art history. And there was much less of a barrier between thinking, hey, I think we need a new subject heading, and creating one with LibGuides than there was with the ERM. People also created subject headings for those format types that we talked about before, like online videos. And also people would create subject headings for things that didn't really follow into either of those categories. So people who were liaisons with the Honors College would say, well, I want to tag everything that the Honors College people should be able to see or need to see, and so create a subject of Honors College, even though it doesn't really fit the cataloger's definition of a subject. You know, it's not about a thing, it's for an audience. But so you had like a wide range of different types of things that were being used as subject headings, with the end result being that when you went to our main LibGuide homepage and went to the Browse LibGuide subject headings list, it was filled with a whole bunch of different things and not always very useful because of the large number of things there were to scroll through. My biggest interaction with the LibGuides was maintenance of the LibGuides A to Z list. The A to Z list was designed to be a list of all of the databases, electronic resources that we subscribe to, that would then be able to be linked to on the LibGuides pages by the liaison. So whenever someone was creating a guide and wanted to have a link to Academic Search Complete, they would just go to Add Content, scroll through the A to Z list titles to find Academic Search Complete, click on that link, and suddenly all the information about Academic Search Complete that was in the A to Z list was showing up on their guide. That was nice because it allowed us that central control of the ER information in LibGuides for titles, links, descriptions, and so on. So whenever someone linked to a entry in the A to Z list on their guide, if we ever needed to update the URL or update the title or update the description, we only had to change the information in the entry, and that change would instantly be reflected in the guides themselves. So to populate the A to Z list, our options were to upload from a spreadsheet or download from Serial Solutions. And since we use Serial Solutions as our knowledge base, that was kind of a no-brainer about which way to go. So our A to Z list was populated by a download from our knowledge base. It basically reached out and grabbed every active database collection that we had marked as subscribed and grabbed the database name and the database URL and imported them into the A to Z list. Now, that was the only information it grabbed. So we didn't have descriptions, we didn't have subjects, we didn't have any of the other options for the A to Z list populated. And we would go through and add those upon request, but we didn't necessarily do a systematic method of making sure that every entry had that information. We would also use the download to update the A to Z list periodically, and we would do the download and it would overwrite things that already had entries and insert things that didn't have entries. So this was really nice because it was able us to get the A to Z list completely populated really quickly, but there were a couple of issues with the download process. First of all, we wound up with a lot of extraneous entries. And the biggest example of that would be our JSTOR collections. So in our knowledge base, we didn't just go in and say we subscribe to JSTOR. We had to go in and activate each individual JSTOR collection we subscribe to. So we subscribe to JSTOR Arts and Sciences 1 and Arts and Sciences 2 and Arts and Sciences 4 because for some reason we skipped over 3, and so on and so forth until we finally have about half a dozen JSTOR collections listed in our A to Z list, but we don't have an entry for just the JSTOR platform in general. So we would have to go in and create a general platform entry in the A to Z list, but we wouldn't typically remove the extraneous ones because there was a good possibility that the next time we did an upload from serial solutions, they would just get inserted as something that didn't previously exist, and it wasn't really a public-facing thing, so we didn't really worry about it. We also had a glitch after the move to LibGuides 2.0, where the download somehow lost the ability to recognize what had and hadn't been uploaded before. And so instead of overwriting things, it just inserted duplicates of a large number of our titles. And so by the time we realized that it happened, people had already linked to the new versions, while people still had links to the old version of their guides. So you might have 100 links to one version of a database and 50-some links to another version of the database in various guides. And so we did some cleanup of that, but we didn't really have the time and manpower to completely clean up all of these little things. So we stopped doing the serial solutions download and began just doing manual updates of things as they came about, because we had the primary list downloaded, and so the overall download wasn't as needed anymore. As I mentioned, this was not a public-facing list, so the priority to clean up these things wasn't quite as high. As long as our LibGuides content creators could navigate the A to Z list, that was the most important thing. That changed in 2013 when the database tab options were updated. As I mentioned before, the database tab is where the subject search was located. It's also where we had our database title search bar. But in 2013, User Interfaces was working to update our website to add some more functionality. And one of their ideas was to add a browsable drop-down menu of ER titles generated from the A to Z list. And they were taking it from the A to Z list because the title list was much easier to tease out of LibGuides than it was to pull out of the ERM. But when they started experimenting with this, they reached out to me to say, hey, Todd, we're doing this, and that title list is really unwieldy and seems to have a lot of duplicates and extraneous things, to which I replied, yes, it does. And so suddenly the cleaning that up moved from a low priority to a high priority. So time for me to do some cleanup. I went through, I removed all the extraneous entries, moved everything except for the main JSTOR, for example. And for other things, I made sure that there was at least a primary platform entry once I removed all the extraneous collection entries that didn't really need to be there. I also went through and removed most of our publisher platforms that had been added to the A to Z list. Most of those didn't have any sort of guides linking to them. Now, the big publishers did. So we had lots of guides that linked to our platform pages for Springer and Elsevier and Cambridge and Oxford and Taylor and Francis and so on. But a lot of the smaller publishers where we might only have like one subscription through, a lot of the associations, there were no LibGuides that linked to them. And just the idea of pruning out the content to a certain degree, we removed all of those, knowing that if someone wanted a platform in the A to Z list, we could just add it manually later. Now, that was kind of the status of both our ERM and the A to Z list for several years. Then in 2018, the LibGuides admin team was formed. Now, the admin team was gone by several names over the last couple of years, but it started out as a group of people who had admin privileges in LibGuides being called together to discuss some of the changes User Interfaces was planning on doing for the library website, because they were wanting to take advantage of a lot of the functionality that had been added to LibGuides over the past several years and incorporate it into the web page. In order to have that work successfully, a lot of changes need to be made on how we approach LibGuides and how content was created and controlled. Some of the guides of the admin team initially were to create workflows for activating and deactivating accounts, since we really didn't have a way to go through and systematically remove accounts whenever people left the institution. We also want to establish and promote best practices. As I said before, there were best practices and guidelines in place, but they hadn't really been thoroughly updated in the 6 years since we had started, and a lot of things had changed both in how LibGuides worked and how people approached the web. So we wanted to make sure that all of those were up to date and that people were being encouraged to follow them. We also want to define guide types, define what should be a subject guide, what should be a a course guide, what should be a topic guide, and also define controlled vocabularies. And this last thing was part that I took part in more than some of the other parts. And that was our attempts to streamline our subject headings in LibGuides. We wanted to go through and make sure that the subject headings in LibGuides were things that were actually subjects and actually relevant to broad departments and degree programs. So that meant that we did away with the format-specific subjects, we did away with the audience-specific subjects, we did away with some of the topic-specific subjects, and we did away with a lot of the more granular subjects. So suddenly, art iconography and art history and design were turned to just art as subjects. And all these things that had been removed from subjects were now being relegated to being used as tags. By using them as tags, they were still searchable, and people could still instruct people to go and do a search for LibGuides to find pages devoted to them. But now the browsing of the subjects and all the other things that would play into the subjects in the website would not have this massive list of things to go through. Now, the biggest thing that the admin team and the changes led to for me was enhancing our A to Z list entries. User interfaces had plans for the web page that required using information from the A to Z list entries, some of which was incomplete and some of which was not used previously at all. So, for example, they wanted to see if we could start adding trial information. Currently, before all of this, if we wanted to have anything about trials visible on the web page, we'd have to notify user interfaces and ask them to add blurbs to the web page about trials, and then also make sure we notified them whenever the trial was over. They wanted to see if there's a way for us to add the information to the A to Z list to make it easier to pull out. They also wanted to be able to add vendor information to the A to Z list, to add database type, which then could take care of those newspaper and video and dataset things, so we could have that information available in a separate way from the subject browse we had before. Also, descriptions. We did add descriptions haphazardly and upon request, but want to make sure that every database had a description available in the A to Z list. And of course, subject headings, which also been used kind of sporadically. Now, as a person responsible for the A to Z list and also responsible for upkeep on the electronic resources in general, it fell to me to figure out the best way to do this. And since all the information they were asking for was already located in the ERM, it just made sense to import the data from the ERM into LibGuides using the LibGuides import data feature. Now, while the information was available in the ERM, it wasn't necessarily available in the format that would be useful for us. So we had to do some ERM cleanup, and more specifically, we had to do subject heading cleanup. Now that we had an authorized list of subject headings for LibGuides that had been vetted by the liaisons, gotten buy-in from all the users, it only made sense to have our ERM subject headings align with the new LibGuides subject headings. So I created a crosswalk between the ERM and LibGuides subjects. Some of these were pretty simple. History was history in both places. Some of them were just a little bit more cosmetic. I believe we had math in one place and mathematics in another, so it was just changing the terminology a little bit, or changing counseling ampersand therapy to counseling and therapy to make sure that everything was consistent in using and instead of ampersand. Because one thing I forgot to mention earlier, I think, was that in LibGuides, if you enter a subject with an and spelled out and an ampersand, it will treat them as two separately different subjects. So we want to make sure that everything was treated the same with that. There are a few other things I had to deal with in the crosswalk. There were ERM subjects that had no corresponding subject in the LibGuide subject list. For most of those, we just removed them from our ERM subjects, but did make sure that any databases that were tagged with that subject had at least one other subject available so that they didn't have 0 subjects assigned to them. And then in cases where there was a subject in the LibGuide list with no corresponding ERM subject, I would reach out to the subject liaison responsible for that subject and say, hey, are there any databases that you think should have this assigned as a subject? so we can make sure that there weren't any orphaned LibGuides subjects that didn't have databases associated with them. We also had a few cases where a combined subject in the ERM had been separated out in the new LibGuide scheme. I believe one example was rehab, addiction, and social work, which now had a rehab and addiction subject and a social work subject. So in those cases, I reached out to liaisons responsible for these separate subjects to say, this database was previously tagged with this combined subject. Should it now just have subject A? Should it just have subject B? Or should it have both? And then depending on the subject liaisons, I made those changes. Once the crosswalk was finished, I went and did global updates to change all the subjects to meet the new standard. I also moved all of the former subject-specific format-specific subject types to the resource type field. Now, we have been using the resource type field for this format-specific information initially, but once we started using the subject field, it didn't always get updated in both fields consistently. So I made sure that anything that had newspapers in the subject field had newspapers in the resource type field, and so on with all the others. We also went through and removed the database letters subjects because the A to Z list in LibGuides was now going to be the basis of our public-facing A to Z list, so that was no longer really needed in the ERM records. Then once I had it all put together, it was time for some fun with spreadsheets. So I created a list of all of our active electronic resource records in the ILS and then exported the data we wanted to put into LibGuides into an Excel spreadsheet. Once I had the spreadsheet exported, I went through all the data to make sure there hadn't been anything wonky going with the transition, and make sure that all the repeatable fields had their data in one single field, so that all the alternate titles are all in one alternate title field. Same thing with subjects, same thing with resource types. And for fields with repeated values, you want to make sure you separate the distinct values with semicolons. I'm saying this now, even though I didn't know it at the time, and it would cause me problems until I learned this, because I want to be sure to reiterate it several times. Separate distinct values with semicolons. We'll talk about that a little more later. But once I had all of the repeatable information in the same fields and made sure that things seemed to be formatted pretty much correctly, I then exported the record information from the A to Z list into a separate Excel spreadsheet. When you do that, be sure to select the template format. It does have a thing that says a CSV format as your export all records format. And since the things say you want to save things in CSV format, you might think that's the way to go. But the CSV format export does not contain all the information you need for this, and it's also not formatted to be re-uploaded into the A to Z list. So you'll want to use the template format. Now, once I had both of those spreadsheets ready, I then had to go through and match each A to Z entry with one ERM entry. This was fairly simple for the most part. There were some instances where the A to Z entry still had the old database name taken from the Serial Solutions download, and the ERM entry had a more current name, and occasionally it took a little while to figure that out. But it's mostly pretty simple. Then we did have a few instances where there was an A to Z entry with no corresponding ERM entry. And these were typically open access databases that have been activated in Serial Solutions prior to the adoption of the ERM. And whenever we did the migration, they didn't have records in the ERDB, so they didn't get records in the resource record. And for these, if I deemed that they were worthy of staying in the A to Z list, then I went ahead and quickly created a resource record and added the necessary fields that they would be able to be imported, and add that information to the ERM spreadsheet as well. And as I went through and matched each entry, I added a unique identifier to link the two resources. And for this, we chose the ERM resource record number, and I input that into the internal note field in the A to Z list template. And the reason for picking the internal note field was it was a field that was not visible to the public, it was not being used for anything, and there are no plans to use it for anything else. And I wanted to make sure that this unique identifier was uploaded into the A to Z list, so if we needed to do another upload at some point in time, whenever I exported it, the unique identifier would already be exported, and I wouldn't have to go through this process of going through and matching each title up individually again. Then once I had everything matched and everything with the unique identifier and the A to Z list linking to something in the ERM spreadsheet, it was time for some more fun with spreadsheets using my favorite Excel function, VLOOKUP. If you're not familiar with VLOOKUP, it is extremely useful. I am eternally grateful to my colleague Karen Harker for introducing me to it and teaching me how to use it. But basically, it allows you to copy data from one spreadsheet to another using a unique identifier. In this case, the ERM resource number that we input into the internal note field. So now that I have everything linked up, I'm ready to use VLOOKUP. I had to go through and see what field in the ERM spreadsheet corresponded to what field in the A to Z spreadsheet. So I had subjects, resource type, access provider, title and alternate title, URL, and description. So those were the big pieces of information I want to transfer from the ERM over to the A to Z list. Some of these were more important than others because there were titles and URLs in all of the A to Z list records. But again, I wanted to make sure that we had the most up-to-date information from the ERM in the A to Z list to make sure that we were aligning all the data between the two. So it didn't matter which one you looked at, the information would be the same. Then once I had all the information transferred from one to the other and had the A to Z spreadsheet populated, I had to go through to make sure that it was really populated. And if you're using VLOOKUP to copy data from one to the other and there's no information to copy, it will give you a null value message. So I had to go through the A to Z spreadsheet to find all the null value messages, and in those cases, determine if there really should be something there or not. So for example, in the alternate title field, there's not necessarily an alternate title. So if there was a null value, I just deleted information from that. But from subjects and resource type and description, there should be something. So if there wasn't something, I had to go back and figure out what the subject should be, what the resource type should be, what the description should be, and enter those into the ERM itself and the ERM resource record spreadsheet, which then would populate the A to Z spreadsheet VLOOKUP. Once I'd gone through and taken care of all those errors and double checked that everything looked good in the A to Z spreadsheet, I saved the template file. It's a CSV format, and I used the import update database function in the A to Z list to upload it. It gives you a preview that will show all the titles available in the spreadsheet and give you any errors in the file. So I have a screenshot of what the preview looks like. You can see it will show what row the information was on in the spreadsheet, what the name of the database is, a copy of the description field, the access provider or vendor information, and then what the A to Z list number is for this, not what the unique identifier that we input is, but the LibGuides unique identifier. You'll also see that one of the entries is pink, and where the other things tell you the database and ask you to check the box to perform an update, this one says an entry in field subjects exceeds 255 characters. So I look at this and I see, oh, it's academic search complete. It's a really general interest database, and we have well over a dozen subjects assigned. So with this importing thing, if we have too many subjects, it's going to exceed the character amount, and it's not going to let me upload it. So for all these things that have too many subjects, I'm going to go in and manually add them. And I'm not really happy about that, but oh well, it's better than adding subjects for everything. However, that's not exactly what the problem was. So here's some tips for importing. Again, use semicolons to separate distinct values in the same field and not commas. If you use commas like I initially did, what it does is it doesn't look at that and see 17 distinct subjects. It sees one subject with 17 items in it, and that one subject is over 255 characters long. Once I discovered this and went back and used semicolons, then there wasn't a problem. However, there were things that got loaded that had multiple subjects separated by commas because they didn't exceed the 255 field limit. And so later on, I discovered that when you browse the subject, you would have English, and then next, under that, you would have the subject English, comma, history, and then English, comma, creative writing, and English, comma, creative writing, comma, history, and so on and so forth. So I had to go back and do a lot of cleanup on the subjects and the resource types and the alternate titles, armed with the new knowledge of how to properly separate them in my upload. Another thing to keep in mind when importing information into your A to Z list is the proxy settings. Now, in the A to Z list with the URL, there's an option that lets you toggle on whether you should use proxy or not with that URL. And if you've entered your proxy prefix into your LibGuides, you can decide to just enter in the base URL itself and then say yes to add the proxy anywhere it's located on your LibGuides. And whenever you export the information from your LibGuides into your template, it has the use proxy field there, and the description says it should have a 0 for a no and a 1 for a yes. However, whenever I exported and looked at it, it had 0s and 1s, but also had the words true and false. So I was a little confused about what to do. And the decision I made was to just change everything's proxy settings to 0s. And then copy over the URLs from the ERM spreadsheet. And if it had a proxy already, it didn't need to have the proxy added. And if it didn't have the proxy already, it didn't need the proxy added. And so win-win all around. What I didn't realize was that when you did the import into the A to Z list, it looks at the URL and goes, oh, there's the library proxy. I know what that is. We don't really need that. Let's strip it off of there and change our proxy settings to yes, which is fine if it worked all the time. Unfortunately, for reasons I have not yet been able to quite figure out, occasionally it strips the proxy but does not turn on the proxy use. So occasionally I would get notices from people off campus who were not able to access things and discovered that the proxy use had not been activated. That's one problem I'm still trying to work through with this process. I recommend not duplicating subjects in both the best bets and subject fields. In LibGuides A to Z list, the best bets is designed to be used for a database that is the best bet if you want information on certain topics. So if you want all the information on political science, you want to go to this database. And so it's marked as a best bet. And the best bets field is a separate field from the subjects field. And I ran into a couple of problems during the uploads whenever I had the same subject in both the best bets and the subject field. So the best thing to do is if you have something in the best bets is just remove that subject from the subject field before doing your upload. And I also recommend after you finish your upload using the filter options in your A to Z list admin screen to verify that all the data fields imported correctly, because you can use a drop-down menu of filters for all your subjects and can scroll through that really quickly to see if you have any instances where you have a comma instead of a semicolon, or where you have a typo, because it shows the number of resources that have that subject. And so if you're scrolling through and you see something that only has one thing assigned, more than likely it's because there was a typo somewhere. Just yesterday, I went in and looked and saw that someone had a resource type of newspaper instead of newspapers. And so we had 30-some newspapers resource types and only one newspaper. So I had to go in and update that in the ERM and the A to Z list. So using those filters can be an easy way to notice those problems that you might have overlooked otherwise. But with all that taken into consideration, I let user interfaces know once I had completed all the information being imported into the A to Z list, and so they made live the new A to Z list. And so here's a little screenshot. You can see I have pulled up the drop-down menu for the subject browse using the subjects in the LibGuides A to Z list. You can see the numbers next to each subject telling you how many databases are associated with each of those subjects. You can also see across the top, all database types drop down. So that's where people could go to find all the resources associated with newspapers, online videos, full text, abstracts and indexes, data sets, and so on and so forth. And also something where if someone wanted to just see the databases associated with EBSCO or with ProQuest or with WorldCat, they could. Over on the right, there's also the new/trial databases information. So one of the things that we've started doing now is anytime we add something new to the A to Z list, we toggle on the new database information and set it to expire after a certain number of months. So now that information will automatically be pulled from the A to Z list and displayed here. And at the end of the number of months, the new tag will disappear and it will drop out of the list. We also do a similar thing with our trials. And now every time we do a trial, we didn't used to add it to the A to Z list, but now we do. And we mark it as a trial and mark it to be disappeared from public view after the trial date ends. So that way it will all appear and disappear without us having to do a lot of extra work communicating with other people to keep track of things. And so that's really the upshot of our attempts to align everything. So some final thoughts on the attempts to align our ERM data with our LibGuides data is that doing so improves the user experience. It causes less confusion when you only have one subject heading used in both areas dealing with databases. And also this way, if someone searches our OPAC, if someone searches our LibGuides, if someone searches the library website, which can pull information from any source you never know as a user, then what they're going to get is going to be the same thing no matter which part they're looking through. So we make sure there's more continuity of user experience across the different things. Now, that being said, we do have to maintain information in multiple places, which is not ideal. We would prefer to only have to do it in one place. But maintaining information in the ERM is really useful from a work perspective for my department, because all of the order information and license information, stuff that isn't really able to be included in the A to Z list, is in the ERM with this information that is included in the A to Z list. And it's easier to just navigate the resource record, all the attached order, license, holdings records there, than having to toggle back and forth between the two. But it's easier to have the information in LibGuides A to Z list in order to help the LibGuides users, help the library website function correctly. So having the information in both places is really ideal for us at this point in time. If we could ever figure out how to get everything just in one place, that would be awesome, but it's really not feasible right now. And so the goal is to do regular imports from the ERM to the A to Z list. Right now, just whenever I update something in the ERM, I go ahead and manually update it in the A to Z list. And whenever I create a new resource in the ERM, I create it in the A to Z list. But the hope is that someday I'll be able to get a regular schedule and do a monthly import so that any changes that get made that I've missed updating manually in the A to Z list will get updated with a regular import. But there's still just a couple of bugs and still a little cumbersome to do it regularly. As a one-stop thing to get all the information from one place to another, the process was great. But doing it on a regular basis, I just don't really have the time right now until I get it down to more of a science. So that's the end of my presentation. I'd like to thank you all for attending it virtually. If you have any questions about anything, please feel free to email me. I might not have all the information available for LibGuide stuff or website stuff, but I can at least pass it on to whoever can answer your questions better. And with that, that's the end of my part of the presentation. So I hope the rest of you have a very nice rest of your virtual NASIG.
Thank you for attending the NASIG 2020 session. The speakers will be monitoring the NASIG forum through June 2020. The links in the forum, SCED, and our code of conduct are below this video. Please tweet about this session using the hashtag NASIG 2020. Thank you.